The instruction took less time than ordering a new pair of boots. Tobias Crane, 7th Duke of Ashford, sat in Mr. Haddon's chambers on a Tuesday afternoon in late February and laid out his requirements with the efficiency of a man purchasing livestock, though he would have been offended by the comparison and would not have recognized its accuracy. "A widow," he said, "quiet, well-bred but not ambitious, no particular family connections that would require management, no debts that would follow her into the marriage, no temperament." He said this last word as though temperament were a disease one contracted through carelessness. "Find me a woman who asks for nothing, Haddon. I have had quite enough of being asked." Mr. Haddon, who had served as solicitor to the Ashford estate for 11 years and had managed the late Duchess's marriage settlement, the late Duchess's funeral arrangements, and the 4 years of efficient, unsentimental widowhood that followed, wrote this down. He did not ask what had prompted the instruction. He did not need to. The Duke had turned 41 in January. He had no heir. His seat in the House of Lords required the kind of social performance that a man without a wife could sustain for a year, perhaps 2, before the absence became conspicuous. Tobias Crane had tolerated conspicuousness for 4 years and had evidently decided, with the same brisk practicality he applied to roof repairs and tenant disputes, that it was time to tolerate a wife instead. "I shall make inquiries," Haddon said. "3 candidates," the Duke replied. "No more. I do not wish to conduct a season's worth of interviews for a position that requires, at its core, very little." He left Haddon's chambers at 3:15, walked to his club, ate a chop, read the evening papers, and did not think about the matter again for 2 weeks. Haddon presented his findings on a Thursday. 3 names, written in his careful clerk's hand on a single sheet of paper, each accompanied by a brief summary of circumstances, family, and Haddon's own addition, unsolicited, character. The Duke read them standing, his back to the fire, his coffee untouched on the mantelpiece. The first was Lady Dorothea Stretton, widow of a baronet, no children, a woman of 52 whose chief recommendation was that she had managed her late husband's Norfolk estate with a competence that bordered on genius. Tobias dismissed her before Haddon had finished the summary. Too capable. A capable widow of 52 would want to manage him, and he had no intention of being managed. The second was a Mrs. Aldcroft, 36, widow of a clergyman, one grown son in the Navy. She was, by all accounts, gentle, devout, and content to occupy herself with needlework and parish charity. Tobias considered this for somewhat longer. Gentle and devout suggested low maintenance. A grown son in the Navy suggested no encumbrances. But the word devout settled in his mind like grit in a boot. He had endured enough sermons from the House of Lords benches without inviting one to his breakfast table. He shook his head. And the third? Haddon cleared his throat. Mrs. Evangeline Croft, widow of Captain James Croft, killed at sea in the action off Ushant 3 years past. She resides in Bath with her 3 children, a daughter of 7, a son of 5, and a daughter of 3. She is the daughter of a clergyman in Wiltshire, good family, modest means, well educated. Captain Croft left a small pension, barely sufficient. She maintains a household on Westgate Street with 1 maid and a nursemaid, a Mrs. Boone, who accompanied the family from their previous lodgings and remains without wages by her own insistence. 3 children, Tobias said. Yes, Your Grace. Under 8. Yes. Tobias looked at the paper. He had specifically asked for a woman who would not complicate his life. 3 children under 8 was the definition of complication. 3 children under 8 was noise and spilt milk, and the constant presence of small people with inexplicable needs. He opened his mouth to dismiss her as he had dismissed the other 2. Her circumstances are the most reduced of the 3, Haddon continued, in the neutral tone of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. She would benefit most from the match, and she is, by every account I have received, a woman who asks for very little. Tobias closed his mouth. A woman who asks for very little. That was what he had requested. That was precisely what he had said. Find me a woman who asks for nothing. Arrange a meeting, he said. I shall go to Bath. He expected gratitude. This was not vanity, or rather it was not only vanity, it was arithmetic. He was a duke. She was a naval widow, living on a captain's pension in rented rooms in Bath, with 3 children she could barely afford to feed. The calculus was so straightforward that he did not trouble himself to consider the possibility that it might not apply. He would arrive, present his offer, and she would accept with whatever modest variations propriety demanded, a pause, a show of deliberation, perhaps a question about the children's schooling that would allow her to pretend the decision required thought. He had seen this performance before. His first wife, Lady Charlotte, had managed it with exquisite grace, and the fact that their marriage had been 12 years of beautifully performed emptiness did not occur to him as a cautionary tale. It occurred to him as a precedent. The house on Westgate Street was smaller than he expected. Not poor, she kept it well, the step was clean, the brass knocker polished, but small in the way that spoke of careful choices made daily between things that mattered and things that could be done without. The hall was narrow. The wallpaper was faded, but not peeling. A child's drawing had been pinned to the wall beside the staircase, a house with 4 windows and a garden, and a figure standing in the doorway that might have been a woman or might have been a tree. Beneath it, in the uneven lettering of a child just learning to write, the word, home. Mrs. Boone answered the door. She was a woman of 60, with a face that suggested she had once been formidable and was now merely implacable. She looked at Tobias from his boots to his hat with an expression that did not change and did not need to. She knew who he was. She knew why he was here. And she was reserving judgment with a thoroughness that would have impressed a magistrate. "Mrs. Croft is expecting you, Your Grace, if you will follow me." The parlor was at the back of the house, overlooking a small garden where a child was digging in the dirt with a spoon. A boy, 5 perhaps, with his mother's dark hair and the particular intensity of a child who has decided that the hole he is digging is the most important undertaking in the history of civilization. This was Kit, though Tobias did not yet know his name, and he was planting a horse chestnut he had found on the pavement outside the pump room the previous week and had carried home in his pocket like a jewel. Evangeline Croft stood when he entered. She did not curtsy immediately. There was a fraction of a pause, barely perceptible, during which she looked at him with an expression he could not read and did not expect. It was not gratitude, it was not deference, it was assessment. She was measuring him the way one measures a room before deciding whether the furniture will fit. Then she curtsied, correctly and without excess, and gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Your Grace, thank you for coming. Please sit down." He sat. She sat. Mrs. Boone brought tea on a tray that did not match. The pot was good china, the cups were not, and one saucer had a chip at the rim that had been filed smooth so it would not cut a lip. Tobias noticed this. He noticed it the way he had noticed everything since entering the house, with the uncomfortable awareness that he was being shown something he had not prepared himself to see. "Mr. Haddon has explained the terms of your proposal," Evangeline said. Her voice was clear, unhurried, pitched at the exact register of a woman who has no intention of wasting either his time or her own. "I have considered them. And I have counter terms." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Tobias blinked. In the garden, Kit had abandoned the spoon and was using his hands. Mrs. Boone, who had remained by the door, shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, the movement of a woman who has heard this before and is bracing herself to enjoy it again. "Counter terms," Tobias repeated. "Yes." Evangeline folded her hands in her lap. She was wearing a gray muslin day dress, high-waisted, very plain, with no adornment except a small brooch at her collar, an anchor in silver. Her late husband's, though Tobias would not learn this for several weeks. "I understand what you are offering, and I wish to be honest with you about why I would accept it. I am not accepting for myself. I have lived on Captain Croft's pension for 3 years, and I could live on it for 30 more. It is not comfortable, but it is not desperate, and I am not a woman who requires comfort to function. I am accepting because my children need what I cannot provide alone. So my terms concern them." She paused. Not for effect, he could see that. She paused because she was organizing her thoughts with the same precision she applied to her household accounts, and she would not speak until the organization was complete. "Mira is 7. She reads at the level of a child twice her age and asks questions that I cannot always answer. She needs a governess, a proper one, not the elderly widow who teaches letters to the chandler's daughters on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She needs books. She needs someone who will take her questions seriously, because I assure you, Your Grace, she will know immediately if they do not. Kit is 5. He is active. She glanced toward the garden, where Kit had now buried both arms to the elbows. He needs space. He needs a garden that will survive his attention. He needs a pony by the time he is 6 because he talks of nothing else. And he needs someone to teach him to ride properly, not the way the ostler's boy has been teaching him on the inn-yard donkey, which is how he broke his collarbone in October. Bess is 3. She needs very little except constancy. She has Mrs. Boone, who is not negotiable. Mrs. Boone comes with us, or there is no arrangement. She has been with the children since Mira was born, and she knows them in ways I sometimes think I do not. She stays. Evangeline unfolded her hands, looked at him directly, and said, "That is what I ask. Their education, their safety, their futures. I ask nothing for myself, because I require nothing for myself. I've already had the marriage I wanted. I am not looking for another one. I'm looking for a father for my children, and you are in a position to be one. Whether you are capable of it remains to be seen." The silence that followed was unlike any silence Tobias had experienced in his adult life. He had sat through silences in the House of Lords that lasted minutes, strategic pauses, rhetorical spaces, the weighted quiet of men deciding the fate of nations. None of them had felt like this. This was the silence of a man discovering that the transaction he had prepared for was not, in fact, a transaction. Or rather, it was exactly a transaction, conducted with a ruthless clarity that left no room for the polite fictions he had been relying on. She was not pretending this was a romance. She was not pretending to be flattered. She was negotiating, and her terms were devastating in their selflessness, because every single thing she asked for was not for her. He left Westgate Street 2 hours later, having agreed to every term and having added 3 of his own that she had not requested: a quarterly allowance for her personal use, new wardrobes for the children upon arrival at the estate, and the retention of Captain Croft's name on the family Bible in the nursery. She had not asked for these. He offered them, because he could not think of anything else to do with the feeling that had settled in his chest, a feeling he did not recognize and therefore could not name, which was the particular discomfort of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone who was not trying to outmaneuver him at all. Mr. Haddon, receiving the Duke's letter confirming the match, read it twice and permitted himself a very small smile. Mira decided within a week. Not that she liked him. Liking was too simple a word for what Mira did with people. She studied them. She had her mother's eyes, dark, watchful, set slightly wide in a face that was still more child than girl, but would not be for long, and she used them the way a naturalist uses a magnifying glass, with patience and an absolute refusal to accept the surface of anything. She watched him at his first dinner with the family, a quiet meal in the small dining room at Westgate Street, arranged by Evangeline as a trial before the move to Ashford Park. Kit had spilt his milk within the first 3 minutes, and Bess had refused to eat anything except bread torn into very small pieces, and Tobias had sat through both events with the rigid composure of a man who has entered a foreign country without a phrase book. Mira ate her soup. She watched him over the rim of her bowl. She said nothing. She watched him the next day when he returned to take them to the park. Kit ran ahead, tripped on the gravel path, skinned his knee, and howled with the full theatrical commitment of a 5-year-old who has an audience. Tobias reached him first, not because he intended to, but because his legs were longer, and some reflex he did not know he possessed had carried him forward before his mind caught up. He knelt on the path in his good coat and looked at the knee, which was bleeding in the minor dramatic way that children's knees bleed, and he said without thinking, "That is an excellent wound. You shall have to show Mrs. Boone. She will be very impressed." Kit stopped crying. He examined the knee with professional interest. "Will there be a scar?" "Almost certainly." "Good." Kit stood up, wiped his nose on his sleeve, and ran on. Tobias straightened, brushed the gravel from his coat, and turned to find Mira standing 3 feet behind him, watching. She was holding Bess by the hand, Bess, who had stopped walking to examine a beetle on the path and was now crouching beside it with the absorption of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. Mira looked at him. He looked at her. Neither spoke. Then she turned and walked on, and the quality of her silence had changed, from watchful to considering, which was, in Mira's vocabulary, the first step toward something that might eventually become trust. They arrived at Ashford Park in April. The carriages pulled up the long drive on a Tuesday morning, Evangeline and the children in the first, Mrs. Boone and the trunks in the second, and Tobias riding alongside on a gray gelding, because he could not face 3 hours in a closed carriage with a 5-year-old who had discovered that the window leather could be used as a catapult. Mrs. Price met them at the door with the household assembled in the hall, 12 servants in a line, silent and correct, as though the arrival of 3 children under 8 was something the house had been expecting for a century and had simply been waiting for. Evangeline walked through the front door, looked up at the hall, marble floors, the staircase curving upward, portraits of cranes going back 6 generations staring down from gilded frames, and said, "Where's the nursery?" Not the bedchamber, not the drawing room, not the morning room or the library or the conservatory or the gardens or the lake. The nursery. Mrs. Price, who had been housekeeper at Ashford Park for 17 years and had served the first Duchess with loyalty and the 4 years of emptiness that followed with something closer to endurance, looked at the new Duchess and felt something shift behind her ribs. "3rd floor, ma'am, east wing. I had it prepared last week. New curtains, the cots brought down from storage, a rocking chair by the window. Mrs. Boone will find everything she needs. I should like to see it before I see anything else." Tobias stood in the hall with his riding crop in his hand and watched his wife climb the stairs with Kit on her hip and Mira ahead of her, taking the steps 2 at a time with the focused energy of a child exploring a castle. Bess was already asleep in Mrs. Boone's arms. The hall was suddenly very quiet. The portrait stared down at him. He had lived in this house his entire life, and it had never once felt as large as it did at that moment, standing alone in the space his new wife had walked through without pausing. He found her 20 minutes later in the nursery, kneeling beside the window, testing the latch. "It sticks," she said without turning, "and the bars are spaced too wide. Kit could fit his head through them. I shall need Galt to send someone up this afternoon." Tobias looked at the window bars. He looked at the distance between them. He performed the calculation that Evangeline had already performed and arrived at the same conclusion. A 5-year-old boy with Kit's particular talent for inserting himself into spaces not designed for 5-year-old boys could absolutely fit his head through that gap. "I shall speak to Galt myself," he said. She turned then, looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not warmth, not yet, but the faintest reduction in the distance she kept between herself and the fact of him. "Thank you." He spoke to Galt within the hour. The bars were fixed by tea time. It was the first promise he made to her children, and it was so small that neither of them would remember it afterward. But Mrs. Boone noticed, and Mrs. Price noticed, and somewhere in the back kitchen, the scullery maid told the boot boy that the new Duchess had looked at the nursery before she looked at the house, and the boot boy said that sounded about right. The weeks settled into a pattern that Tobias had not anticipated and could not have designed. Evangeline ran the household with a competence that reminded him uncomfortably of Lady Dorothea Stretton, the widow he had rejected in Haddon's chambers precisely because he feared being managed. But Evangeline did not manage him. She managed the house, the kitchen, the linen, the accounts, the correspondence, the menus, the tradesmen, the tenants' wives who came to the back door with complaints and gifts and gossip in equal measure. She managed everything that needed managing and asked him about none of it, not because she was meek, but because she was efficient, and efficiency meant not wasting a duke's time on questions she already knew the answers to. She did not come to his bed. He had not expected her to. The marriage had been consummated on their wedding night with a brevity and practicality that matched the terms under which it had been arranged, and neither of them had spoken of it since. She slept in the Duchess's rooms. He slept in his. The corridor between them was 32 paces long, and neither of them walked it. What happened instead was the children. Kit discovered the stables on the second day and formed an alliance with the head groom, a man named Pollock who had the patience of a glacier and the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed by animals 10 times his size. Kit was on a pony within the week, not the pony Tobias had offered to purchase, but an old schooling mare named Button, who had taught 3 generations of Crane children to ride and who tolerated Kit's enthusiasm with the weary grace of a professional who has seen it all before. Kit fell off 4 times in the first fortnight. He climbed back on each time with the cheerful determination of a boy who has been told there will be a scar and considers this excellent news. Bess attached herself to Mrs. Price. This was unexpected. Mrs. Price was not a woman built for attachment. She was built for efficiency, for the smooth running of a household that demanded precision and rewarded routine. But Bess, who was 3 and operated on a logic entirely her own, decided that Mrs. Price's apron was the safest place in the world and could often be found standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand fisted in the housekeeper's skirts, watching the household move around her with enormous dark eyes and an expression of satisfied ownership. Mrs. Price, who had not held a child since her sister's youngest was baptized 11 years ago, did not comment on this arrangement. She simply began carrying a biscuit in her pocket. And Mira found the library on the first afternoon and did not leave it voluntarily for 3 days. Tobias found her there on the second day, sitting cross-legged on the floor beneath the window, a book open in her lap that was far too old for her, reading with the ferocious concentration of a child who has discovered that books are doors and has no intention of closing any of them. She was reading Herodotus, in translation, mercifully, but Herodotus nonetheless. "Do you understand it?" he asked, genuinely curious. She looked up. "Some of it. The battles are confusing because there are too many names, but the part about the woman who warned the king, I understand that." "Artemisia." "Yes." She examined him as though testing whether he had guessed or known. "She told him not to fight the sea battle. He didn't listen. Was she angry?" "The historian does not say." "I think she was angry," Mira said, with the certainty of a 7-year-old who has opinions about women being ignored by kings. "But the kind of angry where you don't shout, the kind where you're right and they know you're right and they do it anyway." Tobias sat down on the library floor beside a 7-year-old girl reading Herodotus and felt something crack in the structure he had built around himself. The structure that said a wife was a practical arrangement and children were complications, and the correct way to live was efficiently, without attachment, with everything in its proper place and nothing left to chance. The crack was small. He did not notice it, but it was there, running through the foundation like a fracture in stone, and everything that followed poured through it. He began seeking her out. Not Evangeline, Mira. He told himself it was because the child was in his library and he wished to ensure she did not damage the bindings, but this was a lie so transparent that even he could see through it, and he was a man with considerable talent for self-deception. He sat with her. He answered her questions. He brought her a proper edition of the Greek myths, not the children's version with the illustrations, but the Lempriere, which was too dense for her, and which she attacked with the methodical determination of a siege engineer, looking up every third word and refusing to admit defeat. He spoke to the governess Evangeline had engaged, a Miss Hartwell, young, Cambridge-educated in all but the degree they would not award her, with a talent for treating children's questions as though they deserved the same rigor as a university tutorial. Miss Hartwell told him, in their first meeting, that Mira was the most intellectually relentless child she had ever taught, and that if she were a boy, she would be headed for a scholarship. Tobias heard this and felt the crack widen and said nothing and went to his study and sat for a very long time looking at the portrait of Charlotte above the mantelpiece. Charlotte, who had been everything correct and nothing real, who had managed their marriage like a performance and died before either of them discovered what lay underneath the performance, if anything did. The conversation happened on a Sunday in May. Tobias was in the garden, Evangeline's garden now, because she had taken to the east beds the way she took to everything, with quiet competence and no particular interest in his opinion, when Mira appeared beside him. She had been crying. He could see the tracks on her cheeks, hastily wiped, and the particular redness around her eyes that children cannot hide however hard they try. "What has happened?" he asked, and was surprised by the alarm in his own voice. "Kit says you are not our real father." She said this with the directness of a child who has decided that the only way through pain is straight through. "He says our real father is dead, and you are just the man who married Mama because she needed money." Tobias knelt. The gravel pressed into his knees. He was at her eye level now, and her eyes, dark, watchful, her mother's eyes, were bright with the effort of not crying again. "Kit is 5, Tobias said carefully. "He understands less than he thinks he does." But is it true? He could have lied. A different man would have lied, would have said, "Of course not," would have smoothed the moment with reassurance, would have patted her head and sent her back inside with a sweet. But Mira was not a child you lied to. Mira was a child who had read Herodotus on the library floor and asked whether Artemisia was the kind of angry where you don't shout, and she deserved better than a convenient fiction. "Your father was Captain James Croft," he said. "He was a good man and a brave officer, and he loved you very much. That is true, and it will always be true, and nothing I do can change it. I married your mother because she needed what I could provide, and I could provide it." That is also true. Mira looked at him for a long time. "Do you love her?" The question hit him with the force of something physical, not because he had not considered it, but because he had been considering it for weeks, circling the question the way one circles a room in the dark, knowing there is furniture to collide with, but not yet knowing where. He did not have an answer, or rather he had several answers, none of which were simple enough for a 7-year-old, and none of which were honest enough for this 7-year-old. "I am learning to," he said. It was the truest thing he had ever spoken aloud. Mira considered this. She was performing the calculation, her mother's calculation, the same methodical assessment, the same refusal to accept the surface. Then she said, "You may marry my mother." "I have already married your mother." "I know, but now I'm saying you may." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "But you have to promise one thing." "What is that?" "You have to read to Bess before bed, every night. Because Papa used to do that, and Mama can't do it because it makes her cry, and Mrs. Boone does it, but she reads too fast and skips the pages with the pictures. Bess knows. She always knows." Tobias looked at this child, 7 years old, standing in a garden in May with tears on her face and gravel dust on her shoes, extracting a promise from a duke with the composure of a woman who has been negotiating all her life. She was her mother's daughter. She was entirely her mother's daughter. And the crack that had been running through his foundations was no longer a crack. It was an opening. It was a door. "I promise," he said. He kept it. That night and every night that followed, through summer, through autumn, through the winter, when Bess developed a cough that kept the household awake for a week, and Mrs. Boone slept on a pallet beside her cot, and Tobias read to her 3 times a night because she could not sleep and he could not leave her. He read the books with the pictures. He did not skip the pages. Bess curled against his chest in her nightgown, smelling of soap and milk and the particular sweetness of a 3-year-old who has decided to trust you. And she fell asleep with her hand fisted in his cravat, and he sat very still in the rocking chair and did not move until Mrs. Boone came to lift her into the cot because he had discovered, at 41, in a nursery holding a child who was not his, that there were things in the world more important than efficiency. Evangeline found him there one evening in October, after Bess had fallen asleep and before Mrs. Boone had come up. He was sitting in the dark, one candle guttering on the mantelpiece, Bess heavy and warm against his shoulder, and he did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway. He did not know how long she had been watching. When he finally looked up, her face was doing something he had never seen it do, the composure broken, not by grief or anger, but by something that had no defenses against it, something that slipped through the cracks in a woman who had armored herself against everything except the sight of a man keeping a promise to her daughter. She did not speak. She crossed the room, leaned down, and placed her hand against his cheek, one palm, warm, steady, 5 seconds. Then she lifted Bess from his arms, settled her into the cot, and left. 5 seconds. He sat in the dark nursery after she had gone and understood with the absolute clarity of a man who has spent his entire adult life avoiding this exact feeling that he was in love with his wife, not learning to be, not approaching it, in it entirely, irreversibly, with no negotiated terms and no counter conditions and no practical arrangement that could contain what had happened to him in a house on Westgate Street, when a woman in a gray dress had looked at him without gratitude and asked for everything on behalf of 3 people who were not him. He went to her that night. 32 paces down the corridor. He knocked. She opened the door. They stood looking at each other in the candlelight, and he said, "Because Evangeline was a woman you did not lie to, and Mira was a child you did not lie to, and he had apparently married into a family that had cured him of his only reliable talent. I wrote to Haddon asking for a woman who would ask for nothing. He found me you. I want you to know that I have never been more grateful for a solicitor's failure to follow instructions." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, really laugh, not the polite social sound she produced at dinners, but something raw and sudden and real, and it broke the last of whatever distance remained between them, the distance she had maintained since Westgate Street, the careful space she kept between herself and the possibility that this arrangement might become something more than an arrangement. "You should know," she said, "that I will never stop asking. I'm counting on it." Years later, years measured in ponies outgrown and books consumed, and Bess's first words at the parish school, and Kit's commission in the Navy, his mother's face at the dock, a mirror of every naval wife who has ever stood in that exact spot and refused to cry until the ship cleared the harbor. Mira stood in the drawing room at Ashford Park in a white gown, holding a bouquet of roses from the East Garden, preparing to marry a young man named Fellows, who had survived her inspection by the narrowest of margins, and who understood, with the clarity of a man who has been thoroughly assessed, that he was marrying into a family where the women set the terms. "Tell me again," her husband said, straightening his cravat in the mirror, "how the Duke won your mother over." Mira smiled. "He didn't win her over. She laid out her terms and he met every one of them. That's not winning someone over. That is passing an examination." "And you? How did he pass your examination?" "I told him he had to read to Bess every night before bed. She was 3. She knew when you skipped the picture pages." "And he agreed?" "He agreed. And he never skipped. Not once. Not even the night Kit put a frog in his boot and he had to read with his foot in a basin of cold water because the frog had... Well, Mrs. Boone handled the frog." Fellows laughed. Mira watched him in the mirror, this man she had chosen with the same careful deliberation her mother had taught her, the same refusal to settle for surface, the same insistence on terms, and thought of the afternoon in the garden when the Duke had knelt on the gravel and told her the truth because she was not a child you lied to. She thought of her mother's hand on his cheek in the nursery. 5 seconds. The 5 seconds that changed everything. She thought of her father, her first father, Captain James Croft, whose name remained in the family Bible in the nursery, exactly where Tobias had promised it would stay. And she missed him with the particular ache of a woman who had been loved well twice, once by the man who raised her, and once by the man who chose to. Downstairs, the guests were assembling. Tobias Crane, Duke of Ashford, stood in the hall in his best coat, waiting to walk his eldest daughter to the altar. He was not her father by blood. He was her father by every measure that mattered, by Herodotus read on library floors, by ponies named Button, by a promise extracted in a garden by a 7-year-old who understood, before any of them did, what family actually required. They arrive here, like a child deciding to trust someone, whenever they are ready.